Hello all. Now I want to finish our series on Whitehead on the channel with a look at science in the modern world in specifics, because I think it's the most enriching thing that Whitehead has to offer, beyond just the metaphysics or critiques that he put forth in my previous videos. I want to look at what I think is the fruits to bear of his actual philosophy. And I think within science in the modern world, you can see what his project really was about and what he really thinks of these things. And so I think one of the main ideas that you could see within it is the historical relationship that science and philosophy have towards each other, or in this case, as he would put it, with the creative poets of concrete experience, as we'll get into. But for Whitehead, of course, as we've talked before, philosophy has two different distinctions, if you will, with the critical speculation of analytics, which is to come in the 20th century, certainly with positivism, and the other with metaphysical speculation. So, of course, philosophy has a long tradition of critiquing scientific abstractions, or holding up to scrutiny whether or not these systems are logical, or in this case ordered towards reason. And so you can see perhaps historically the divisions to come with, of course, as mentioned, logical positivism and its arguments towards logical structure in that empirical school, if you will, post 1935, and you see the turn away from metaphysics and that kind of speculation, although there is that sort of resurgence to come since. But getting into the actual text, if you will, I wanted to, of course, start with what he considers with the order of nature. And this is really him setting the table for critiques of mechanistic science. And so the order of nature is in and of itself a presupposition for science to work, and for mathematics to have its order as well. As we've mentioned before, he's really using the Platonic tradition, especially with the Middle Platonists, of form. And he is one to take the position that aesthetics and its values and truth, as it were, has a satisfaction to it from our own experience as human beings on a description basis. That sort of aesthetic harmony is something that we suppose onto it. It comes from our own aesthetic appreciation. And so modern science, then, for Whitehead, is actually a furthering of the abstractions that were left behind prior, with accordance to atomistic science, or the mechanistic science. And going from that, you can see his distinction towards concrete experience, or in this case, the poet's reaction, the romantic chapter, that romanticism that Whitehead still is trying to tap into with idealists like Bradley and others. Concrete experience, then, is the perception of the event in a phenomenological description. Poetry is the lived experience and a reaction against the aesthetic sterilization that modern science presupposes onto the world. Another interesting side note is to see, perhaps, how these abstractions, these the furthering, if you will, from mechanistic science towards relative theory, if you will, and how these abstractions continue to complexify away from sensory description, and that certainly continues to be true as you go through past Whitehead into the 21st century. So I think that's something to perhaps tip off to in today's in how we look at it. But and as an aside, Whitehead sees Christianity really as a non-metaphysical religion. He thinks that his process theology is something that can actually be suited towards a Christian metaphysical system. And so when he documents the history of science, and he turns towards, of course, the Western understanding of matter to come with Newton. In the case of Descartes, though, as he is more specific, the stuff we know not, spread out over a spatial plane that doesn't have any sort of telos or a value or a purpose to it. That 16th century description, is imposed by these external relations. But for Whitehead, he has two distinctions: the artificial one, which in the cases with Descartes and mind and body as the example, artificial relationships for Whitehead are incidental. They don't make up the nature, if you will, of A and B itself and the properties that make up to it. There's causal expression within there, but that doesn't actually comprise those identities between two substances. So, the mind has a sort of independence from body mechanics, and vice versa. So, in the case of what he uses for Descartes here, whereas the internal relationships for Whitehead are actually the virtue of the identity of A and B. So he's really using that Hegelian identity, if you will, of servant and master. That's the relationship. They become self-aware, within each other, and so A and B has an eternal relationship, just like the master and the servant here. What he's really trying to get at, though, with these early chapters is that there is a faith within scientific abstraction through this order of how nature is. That's how we make sense and make use of science. Because with Hume's insight of, there is no empirical evidence of causality. These are simply abstractions or ideas in that tradition. But for Whitehead, though, we get the idea of nature, though. We do know an orderedness of nature through experience, phenomenologically. The sun will rise because we know the way nature is ordered. We can, map out that sort of evidence, even though we don't know it empirically. And so, obviously, with that distinction, he's getting at secondary qualities and their subjectiveness. But this is the offspring of the mind, of the romantic, of the creative aspect of human experience, of concreteness. And so nature gets the credit of beauty, but it's actually the poetic diction of beauty, of our aesthetic appreciation. And so the credit should go to the poet for Whitehead. It's not the case that nature has its goodness. It's much more nuanced than that, with our actual own human expression involved, and we give that sort of telos, the ends, if you will. Then when he turns to mathematical order, of course, the Pythagorean forms, if you will, this is the eternal range of order of what is, the logical structure of things in the world. And so with that in mind, that's really him, leading towards relative theory of, his metaphysics, if you will. That's vibration. It's energy. We degrade as with our bodies and experience as we get older, and the energy leaves us. So he has a sort of vibration, if you will. Whereas, his predecessors with John Locke, they had that atomistic view, where matter is the perspective of pallets. And so, the romance to come out of that is from the perspective of atomism. That's what he's trying to say with the relationship of science and the romantics and the poets. And so when he talks of quantum physics, this is how he gets that vibratory capacity, coming and going. And another distinction to point out is interrelations. This is between two material static properties. This is, of course, the Hegelian influence of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He's emphasizing on the process between the relativeness of two objects, A and B. And this is coupled with his critique of induction, where moments of experience unrelated to atoms, they have no concept of these internalized relationships. As Hume would have said, there's no, these are just abstractions, conjunctions, but we can't actually empirically prove the connection, or the importance of that connection, if it were. It's just an abstraction. And when he looks at time and space, perhaps his biggest critique of these abstractions with science is simple location. Due to the interrelations between A and B not being statically imposed due to the movement in time, where space, of course, is all relationship in its inference. And so this is what he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. With the fixed point, it's just an abstraction. It's not reality, because everything's in motion. Everything is in that sort of relativeness. And that's what his counter, if you will, especially in a philosophical canon, Bergson, with his theory of time, what he calls the instantaneous material configuration, in his critique of simple location. Time is a distortion of nature for Bergson, even though Whitehead doesn't necessarily totally agree with that. But yeah, if we were going to move on with Whitehead terminology here, turning to his concept of prehension. Prehension is best seen as, a kind of dualism, a double aspect theory. An event, as we've talked about before on the channel, has physical and conceptual aspects to it, given way to objective physicalism, if you will, physical data in process comes into physical causation, and the conscientiousness of stimulus give way for what makes eternal possibilities come into being. And so for the conceptual aspect, then, you have the causal abstraction, of course, substance, quality abstraction as the example is. And then he turns to the separation of space and time in that atomistic model, where, to make that sort of separation, to have the abstractions of simple location or whatever the case is, has that sort of prehensive characteristic. So the model is misplaced because you're separating space and time for that atomistic model in that day. And this, of course, sets way for Berkeley, who famously said to be is to be perceived. But for Whitehead, reality is the prehension on an ontological level, if you will. God's thinking is prehension, is the prehension not in the actual material objects, but in its thinking. And so concrete fact is the process of underlying action of the prehension of each event, a matter of fact of some substrate of activities. So even, the individual, if you will, doesn't have that sort of independence. It'd be a faulty model because of, these relations of activities. And I think another distinction to make with Whitehead and his predecessors, of course, with regards to Locke, is that Whitehead is looking at, the mind from the perspective that it's an active participant. Mind is reaching our attention spans, our attention to what is detailed to us, what is aesthetic to us, as it were. It's what we select. This isn't just a passive blank slate that has externals bestowed upon it, but we actually are reaching out into that. So action is beyond just the subjective ideas. Rational coherence, as Whitehead would call it, or unified explanation. That's within the criteria of aesthetic truth. Having value or being end-orientated is the intrinsic reality of satisfaction achieved in that poetic nature, which is bestowed upon us out of limitation. Possibilities then are narrowed to what becomes actually aesthetic or good in attainment out of those limits. And so that really is how you get to the kernel of Whitehead's conception of God as that principle of limitation. And so if you have a principle of limitation, you can't really give a sort of reason to God's emergence, because it's through his own existence in the ground of concreteness, out of limitation. So you can't really have that nature of God outside of the unity of all possibility. And so I think if anyone who's into that sort of romance, poetry, the arts, seeing this display of the differences between and the relationship of how science can inspire the arts, or in many cases actually sterilize them, as it were. Whitehead is another classic example of a philosopher who understands that concreteness, as he'd put it, is in the arts. That's why Spangler, in his historicism, would say the arts are superior to science and its sterilization. you're going to understand more into human experience and into a culture's experience in that sort of spring setting, if you will, out of romance, out of that, as opposed to that winter sterilization. It's also interesting, perhaps, to point out in conclusion here how, with the contributions of Western, the West towards science, with mechanistic science and then relative theory, what as a particular mode of how our science in particular seems to have that sort of uncovering aspect towards metaphysics and sterilization. I think there seems to be an exception with our civilization with that sort of sterilization of creativity. Today there seems to be quite the discourse on a lack of creativity, even though we live in supposedly the most free time in history of human spirit, and yet it seems so banal. Every other person you would probably talk to would say that we live in a very uncreative time, and I think most people would actually probably agree and would point towards science or some properties of it technologically. So it's interesting to perhaps overlay that too in the commentary towards science and modern world. But yeah, that's going to do it for Whitehead, and we'll be moving on from there. And I hope you guys enjoyed these videos, and subscribe to the new YouTube channel since I still can't get a grasp of the old one, I suppose. And yeah, follow me on Twitter at Bongo Bongerson, and I hope to see you guys and have more conversations.